hand you over now to Katrina Crowe, who's the curator of the first Thought Talk. So thank you again very much. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Oisin's mic is working perfectly, which is always nice to know. You're very welcome to our First Thought programme for this year in our new upgraded venue, because there are so many smart people in Galway who want to hear the fabulous conversations that we commissioned that we needed more space. So thank you so much for filling it today. Ukraine faces a bleak situation as both Russia and the US appear increasingly aligned against a nation that has bravely resisted an unprovoked invasion for over 3 years. The conflict carries serious implications for European security, unchecked Russian aggression, and a dramatic shift in US foreign policy influenced by presidential admiration for autocrats. Historian Phillips P. O'Brien, widely regarded and admired for his expert analysis of the war, will discuss these issues with journalist and author Lara Marlowe. Lara is the author of How Good It Is I Have No Fear of Dying, Lieutenant Yulia Mykytenko's Fight for Ukraine, a nuanced portrait of a complex country enduring invasion. Sorry, what did I do? Oh, she has it. Saleswoman in chief. I wish I could say it was for sale outside, or there was one for everyone in the audience, but alas, I cannot. This is a nuanced portrait of a complex country enduring invasion, seen through the eyes of a remarkable young female soldier, and I commend it to you as a really interesting insight into what it's like on the ground in Ukraine. Lara is a former Washington and Paris correspondent for the Irish Times and has published 3 other books, including The Wonderful Love in a Time of War, her memoir of her relationship and work with the late Robert Fisk. She has reported extensively from the Middle East, and as you can see, she is the most elegant woman in Galway.
Thank you, Katrina. I hope I can live up to that. When Katrina contacted me several months ago and asked me if I would interview Professor O'Brien, I said, would I interview Professor O'Brien? I would be thrilled to interview him. I would love to interview him because ever since I started working in Ukraine, I've been reading him like the Bible, and he's probably the only commentator who I invariably always agree with. So I hope that doesn't make for a boring interview today. Professor O'Brien teaches strategic studies, international relations, history of war, whatever, at St. Andrews in Scotland, and he's just written this book, War and Power, which comes out next month. You'll have to wait for it, which is Ukraine, but far more than Ukraine. It's also the history of the First World War and the Second World War and modern warfare, per se. And it's a version that you've never read before. So I thought I would start by asking him about current affairs. On Bastille Day, last Monday, President Trump did what appeared to be a flip-flop, because his administration had suspended arms transfers to Ukraine 2 weeks earlier, and suddenly he said, no, 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 we're going to let NATO buy weapons from the US and then they can give them to Ukraine. And he also, for the umpteenth time, threatened sanctions, or sanctions and secondary sanctions against Russia and people who buy Russian goods. But he's put a 50-day limit on, he gave Putin 50 days. Yep. So I want to ask Professor O'Brien, what does this all mean? Has Trump changed his tune? Is he getting tough on Vladimir Putin all of a sudden?
I'll start with the good news, but there'll be a lot more bad. The good news is there will be Patriot missile air defense systems heading to Ukraine relatively soon. No one knows when. It was originally thought to be longer than people would have liked, months. It might now be weeks.
Do we know how many or where they're coming from?
We don't know how. I mean, this is the thing, is Trump is opaque compared to Biden. The Biden administration listed everything that they sent in their military aid to Ukraine. The Trump administration simply doesn't seem to keep records, certainly doesn't announce records. And I have been assured by this by NATO sources who, on the whole, don't like that I'm quite critical. And they contacted me and said, yes, we can assure you Patriots are going to go to Ukraine. So that Patriot missile system, and what it is that it seems to be both, interestingly, Swiss and German allocated Patriots.
But the Swiss are not in NATO.
The Swiss are not in NATO, but they're not going to get the ones they were supposed to get. They're going to go to a European state and then be sent to Ukraine. So there will be more air defense heading to Ukraine in the relatively near future, though it still could be months. I mean, we could be talking, and I have a feeling they won't have an impact until after this 50-day period is over. So that's the good news. Ukraine will have more air defense at some point, probably in the fall. The bad news, and I think ultimately people have really drastically overstated the good. I mean, Trump has this way of playing on people's hopes. Oh, maybe now he'll do the right thing. Maybe now. And they did this. This is the minimum the U.S. should do. Biden would have done far more and been criticized for it, for not doing enough. Trump does the minimum, and people say, Hosanna. But when it comes to what he also did, the 50-day thing is deeply pernicious. Because everyone was saying the United States is going to come down. They were saying 2 weeks ago, Trump has changed his tune. He's going to hammer Putin with sanctions. And what Trump actually did is gave Putin breathing space. He didn't say, I will bring in sanctions in 50 days. He says, in 50 days, I might bring in sanctions. So it's at least a 50-day period where Putin doesn't have to worry about sanctions. And what Trump has done since becoming president is not bring in a single new sanction. Now, you might say, oh, that's letting things stand still. But what it actually does is it allows networks of sanctions evasion to bed down and become more efficient. So the Russians are getting far more in than they were getting before Trump was president because there are no new sanctions. They find ways around the old sanctions, and those networks are working. So what Trump is actually doing is allowing Putin and the Russians to get their hands on far more components because there won't be new sanctions. So yes, there is something good in this, but it's only defensive firepower. You know, it might protect Ukrainian cities a little bit more, but ultimately, really, this is letting a status quo go on in which the United States is, I would say, providing significant support to the Russians.
Now, one thing that Trump mentioned in this Bastille Day statement was he said, unless Vladimir Putin makes peace, it's not clear, is it that he has to accept this 30-day ceasefire, which Trump proposed, or which Zelensky accepted last March, I believe. Zelensky said last year, I believe there will be peace in 2025. And Lieutenant Mykytenko, the woman I read the book about, told me she really thought there would be peace this year, or at least a ceasefire, because her troops are tired, the Russians are tired, everybody's tired. This ceasefire, though, just keeps eluding us. It just keeps sliding back further and further and further. Do you think there will be a ceasefire this year?
There could be. I mean, for the reasons you say, both armies are exhausted. And both armies are running out of certain equipment they can't make. I mean, there are very few vehicles left on the battlefield, because a vehicle goes on the battlefield and it's destroyed very quickly by UAVs.
The Russians are using motorcycles.
Yeah, the Russians have to use motorcycles because they can't send a tank. I mean, who would have thought that actually the motorcycle would be the key weapon of advance over the tank? But tanks are too vulnerable. They appear and they're seen 20 miles behind the lines and taken out. So it will be very hard for either army to move, and it's becoming increasingly hard for either army to move. And what the Russians are doing is actually biting off tiny little chunks up to like a quarter of a mile at a time.
Knowing they'll be able to keep it because Trump has said so.
Knowing they'll be able to keep it. And the other thing is, this is going to be horrible. Brace yourself. Ukrainian cities are going to get the crap kicked out of them this summer. Because the new Patriots are coming, but by the way, Patriots alone aren't enough. Patriots are a very high-end system. We can talk about that. The Russians have put all their construction effort into air attack, so into the Shahids, into the Calibers, into the Kinjals. And they are producing those while Ukrainian air defense is running down. So there's going to be, what we've seen is just a taste of what we're about to see. 1,000 Shahids a night mixed in with 50 missiles of different kinds. So Ukrainian cities are going to be hit pretty bad. By the way, though, the Ukrainians are going to be able to strike back with some of their own long-range systems, which are coming online in production. And you could see that double development in the war leading both sides to say, okay, maybe we should have a ceasefire. So it's not out of the question. On the other hand, I think as long as Putin thinks Trump isn't going to really help Ukraine, Putin seems to have gambled that, okay, the United States, he might have over-gambled, but he gambled the United States was switching sides, and which, by the way, has a huge spillover impact because the Chinese can now provide more components to the Russians because they're not worried about falling out with the US. And we can see a growing number of Chinese components.
And the Chinese also feel liberated to attack Taiwan because they know Trump won't do anything.
We're going to go.
That's another whole nother
subject. I mean, I could say one thing about I was talking with someone from the US DoD who will go nameless the other day, and he said the United States is spending more time actually planning to fight aliens than to defend Taiwan. The United States isn't going to fight for Taiwan. No. Trump's never going to fight for Taiwan. Chinese know that. So really, their only calculation is whether they want to go full out for an attack on Taiwan or not, because they know the U.S. won't. And by the way, the Japanese have basically said to Japanese companies, if you're in Taiwan, you're on your own. Yeah. So Taiwan is being abandoned. That's another thing.
Think back a few months to February 28th, when you watched on television the ambush in the Oval Office. Yeah. What went through your mind? What was your reaction? What did you feel?
This was reality TV. I mean, what we saw in the Oval Office was exactly what Trump and Vance believe. That they hate Zelensky. Trump. One thing where Trump still is with Putin entirely is they want to get rid of Zelensky. This has been a key element of U.S. policy under Trump. That they even have other candidates for the job they've been bigging up, ones that you would know probably aren't too well known outside of Ukraine, but old recycled leaders. So they've been wanting to get rid of Zelensky. They view him as an impediment to a, I think, very pro-Russian peace.
Is this because of he refused to investigate Hunter Biden? How much of it is just revenge for that?
I think for Trump, a lot of it seems to be. For Trump's point of view, Zelensky wasn't helpful, and Trump doesn't forgive.
Yeah, he wants yes men, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Trump I think it was Axios first leaked Trump's so-called, I put it in quotation marks, peace plan.
Yeah.
Back in April. And you wrote a brilliant piece on Substack outlining the peace plan and saying what was wrong with it. So if you agree, I'd like to go through the 5 main elements of Trump's peace plan.
Yep.
And I want you to tell us what's wrong with them.
Yep.
Number 1, the US would officially recognize Russia's annexation of Crimea. What's wrong with that?
This, by the way, this is the one that people, if you say, oh, of course the Russians are going to keep Crimea, what you're doing is kissing post-1945 Europe goodbye. There has not been a single change in a European state border that was done by conquest. Yes, Yugoslavia broke apart. That is right. But this would be one European state invading and seizing the legally recognized territory of another European state, which, by the way, had been guaranteed by the United States, Russia, and major European powers under different accords. And so you're basically saying, okay, all borders are up for grabs. Yep. All right? If Crimea is up for grabs, Donegal is up for grabs. All right?
Greenland?
Yeah, and Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, by the way, are looking at this very closely. Yeah. If we in the West somehow cavalierly say, of course, that's just Crimea, we'll let the Russians have it, the people in the Baltics and the Nordics are going to look at this as an extraordinary betrayal. And it does mean the end of the European order. We are entering a new world.
One argument I hear a lot in Paris, where they have a certain soft spot for Russia, many of them, is that, and this is Putin's argument, sure, Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine. It was always Russian. What do you say to that?
Well, how did the French get Corsica? I mean, if we're going to go and redo all historical, the Germans should be able to ask for a lot of Poland.
And
the Poles should be able to ask. Yeah, if we're going to start saying, we can redraw borders because of history, good luck, Europe.
Okay.
Because Europe ends.
Second provision of the Trump peace plan. De facto recognition of the 4 oblasts or regions which Russia holds in part, that is to say Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson.
Yep, because that means, one, the Russians have a claim to land they don't even control. That Russia controls none of the 4 oblasts.
They claim they have all of Luhansk, actually.
Almost, it's like 98%, I guess, at this point.
And they have about 70%.
But they don't have all of the rest.
Yeah.
And it is also, I mean, the U.S. wasn't going to recognize those as sovereign Russian territory. So it was a little different than Crimea. But it is, in a sense, I think, putting them in a pre-Crimea stage.
Basically, possession is 9/10 of the law.
Possession and illegal annexation.
Yeah.
Because the Russian parliament has illegally annexed those provinces under the UN. By the way, the other thing, UN's dead. If any of this goes through, the UN's gone.
Third tenet of the peace plan, Ukraine cannot join NATO.
Again, it's a fascinating one. It's basically saying Ukraine isn't really a sovereign state.
Yeah. And didn't NATO promise twice, at least, in 2008 and in Vilnius in 2023, they promised Ukraine that they could join?
Irreversible path to NATO. Remember, they didn't have a date, but they said it was an irreversible path to NATO membership. There's 2 things that are the problem with that. One, it means Ukraine really isn't sovereign. It is subject to the political control of Russia. So Russia can tell Ukraine what its international status will be. Big states can tell small states. Ireland should love that. The second thing that it means is that Ukraine becomes a constant source of tension in Europe. If Ukraine is not eventually in NATO, then at any time this war can re-emerge. And that means that there will never be peace between Russia and Ukraine. The one thing we have seen is Russia doesn't attack NATO. It attacks states that aren't in NATO. Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine. So if you're in NATO, you don't actually get attacked to this point.
Not yet.
Not yet. Well, the question, I suppose, is whether NATO exists.
Yeah,
And
we'll get to that.
That's debatable.
Fourth item of the Trump peace plan, the sanctions that have been imposed against Russia since 2014 will all be lifted.
Yes, it was whether they'd all be lifted right away. They certainly would be partially lifted right away under the Trump peace plan, and maybe all be lifted.
Now, are these U.S. sanctions or international sanctions?
Well, the U.S. has cooperated with the Europeans in bringing in sanctions on Russia, so they've been cooperative mostly to this point, though right now Europe's going farther. But basically, if the U.S. says that's it, back to business fully with Russia, then everyone, the Chinese can give the Russians any military equipment they want. Anyone could basically, outside of Europe, the Europeans could try to complain, but there's nothing they could do. So that opens up Russia for full economic integration.
So there's no punishment whatsoever for having destroyed Ukraine?
There's a reward. They've gotten Crimea, and they will have kept the territory. They've gotten rewards for having invaded Ukraine.
And finally, and one suspects this is a lot of Trump's motivation, enhanced cooperation with the U.S., especially in energy and industry.
Yeah, that's the payoff, that Trump would make a lot of money out of that. That there would be U.S. This has always been the goal of the Trump administration, is to have closer business ties with Russia. Steve Witkoff, who's Trump's roving ambassador, has been talking up business opportunities with Russia. Trump has been doing business with Russia since before the Cold War. When it was the Soviet Union, he has been doing a lot of business. So this, I think, is another example of basically getting back to business and making as much money as possible.
Actually, that was one of my questions is, when I see what Trump says about his friend Vladimir and his indulgence towards Russia, you have to wonder, what hold does Putin have over Trump? Do they have compromat on him? Is it money? Is it because they saved his business, his failing businesses several times?
Which they have with loans.
Yeah. Or is it just admiration? Is it dictator envy? Or is it all three? What do you think?
He's not a Russian agent. Yeah, you saw the Krasnov. I mean, that's nonsense. Because, by the way, the Russians wouldn't recruit someone so unreliable. No, historically, they would have said they wouldn't have.
Pretty well for them,
they wouldn't have touched him as a recruitable agent in the 80s because he couldn't have been trusted. But he has had, as you pointed out, enormous business ties with Russia. Russia has saved his companies numerous times by providing last-minute, almost interest-free loans on a massive scale to keep him going. He absolutely admires, but he loves dictators. He just loves them. I mean, he loves Kim Jong-il. He loves the North Korean. He hates democratic leaders, and he likes dictators.
He likes Bolsonaro. He likes Netanyahu.
He loves Netanyahu. He loves actually Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
There's a lot of admiration there. Is there compromise? God knows what he got up to in Moscow under the cameras in the late 80s and early 90s. I wouldn't want to know. I'm sure you wouldn't want to see the films either. I'm a little less, I mean, there probably is compromise, but at this point, he could do whatever he wanted and his backers back him anyway. Yeah, I mean, the Epstein tapes could come out and it wouldn't make a difference. So I think it's more just he likes Putin. He's made a lot of money. He has I think this is the thing. There's no ethical difference in his mind between democratic Europe and dictatorial Russia. We all, well, hopefully most of us exist in the world where we see an ethical difference, right? I mean, you might not see as vast as some people, but there is democratic Europe, there is dictatorial Russia, and that hopefully makes an influence in how one thinks.
I think he
doesn't make a difference.
prefers dictatorial Russia because they control their population.
Yep.
They have traditional values. They hate homosexuals and lesbians and transgender people and so on. And they believe in God, and they hate immigrants. I mean, he's got a lot in common with them, hasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, his populist wing, he, of course, what does he actually believe is very difficult to say, but his backers, there's a very strong MAGA admiration for the public stances of Putin, who doesn't believe any of the stuff he actually says either. So that is certainly the identity of it in Western Europe. J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, which was basically, you soft Europeans are too weak.
And too hard on hate speech.
It's far too mean, yeah. But which, by the way, is also their view. So.
Going back to the peace plan for a minute, the New York Times wrote a pretty shocking editorial, which you picked apart. How can it be that the newspaper of record in the United States is basically espousing this horrible peace plan, which is totally against international law? You recently wrote another Substack about the New York Times. I mean, I hate to criticize colleagues, but at the same time, when you can't trust the New York Times, who can you trust?
I don't think you can trust anyone. I mean, there's some really good reporting everywhere. There's some really bad reporting everywhere. And I'm a subscriber to the New York Times, and I certainly wouldn't ask anyone not to subscribe to the New York Times because I think it's an invaluable source. I think the New York Times, I mean, the most shocking thing, it'd be interesting to get your view about this, is how the media in the second term has basically said we need to be nice to Trump. We tried to be mean to him in the first term, didn't make a difference. So instead of being mean, we're going to agree with him a lot, and we're going to try and find common ground. Or in the most extreme cases, we are going to pay him off.
Yeah, but I think the fear of lawsuits is also a factor. I mean, he just made a settlement with CBS. Was it 19 million?
16 million. It was something. It was a large amount of money that they shouldn't have paid.
The Wall Street Journal.
They shouldn't have paid a dime to him. And they paid 16 million, I think, or maybe it was 19. But the papers have paid him off. And he's now suing the Wall Street Journal, which will be interesting because the Journal has been one of the most supportive papers of Trump. But Murdoch actually might fight him on that. It would be an irony if Rupert Murdoch is the one newspaper to stand up to Trump in the courts. But let's see. I don't think Murdoch will pay $10 billion, which is what Trump's asked for.
It's become obvious that Ukraine cannot rely on the US. Can it rely on Europe? And can Europe replace the US?
Well, there is no Europe in this. There are certain European states that have gone above and beyond the call that really Ukraine can rely upon. Unfortunately, none of them are the quote-unquote big states. So it can rely, the Nordics have been brilliant. From Denmark to Finland to Norway to Sweden, they've been superbly helpful. The Baltics have been helpful. Poland's mostly been helpful. And Poland's had a few interesting issues. The Romanians, on the whole, have been really good. The Czechs have been great. So there have been a number of European states that have been, Europe gets, I think you have to classify Europe into 3 or 4 different kinds of groupings. They can count on those states. My real fear is that Europe splits, which I don't think people have gone into the reality enough, that if Trump basically says to Ukraine, take this terrible deal, you have to take this deal. And the British, who are desperate to keep the special relationship, which doesn't exist, going, the French, with their pro-Russian views, the Italians, Meloni.
Not the government.
Not the government, but if they say, okay, Ukraine, you do have to take this, which is not this is a reasonable scenario to imagine, but then Ukraine's friends go, the Baltics and Finland go, no, we're not going to, and then Europe could split, and one group could go hard in for Ukraine, and the other group could pull apart. And that is what I mean. Europe is on a precipice where Europe could cease to be the Europe we know.
There's also a great danger of Europe being transformed from the inside. I mean, of nationalist populist governments like Viktor Orban, Robert Fico, I can't even say it.
Fico. Or is it pronounced
Fico? I think the C is pronounced like t. Anyway, Fico.
Yep.
You've got Giorgia Meloni in Italy who could sway kind of both ways. You could get Nigel Farage in Britain. You could get Marine Le Pen in France. We almost got a nationalist populist pro-Russian in Romania if they hadn't canceled that election in December. There's a nationalist populist candidate in the Czech Republic for elections in the autumn. I mean, is it possible that Vladimir Putin will just basically infiltrate all these countries where he's meddling in elections and just kind of take over?
The big one's France. The British won't have an election for 4 to 5 years, 4 years, because the Starmer has such a large majority. Why would he risk it? The Germans aren't going to have elections for a few years because Merz is.
The AfD is waiting in the wings.
But France is having an election next year.
27.
Oh, is it 27?
Presidential, okay. Yeah.
That's the scary one, because if France goes, National Front, that's a pretty major move in the pro-Putin camp. So I would think that's the one that they're playing for.
And in terms of weaponry, military assistance, can Europe replace the US? What about the US intelligence, which the Ukrainians need for targeting Russia? What about the Starlink system? What can Europe do for them?
Europe cannot replace the United States, but it can compensate for the loss of the United States. This is one of the things, it's never been a question of capacity. I mean, I'd love to have this discussion with the Europeans. Europe combined is 20% of the world GDP, okay? It's one of the most high-tech, conversant places in the world. It has 500 million people, more, 550 million people. It is, by any metric combined, it should be one of the great powers of the world. The reason it's not is societal and structural, not economic and technological. It does not wish to play that role. Its politicians are not capable of playing that role, and its societies don't want that role, so far. So if Europe said, which I think they should have said, I mean, the first time I wrote an article about this was in late 2023, which was like, Trump is coming. He might not win, but he's gonna be the presidential nominee of the Republican Party in 2024. And if he is elected in 2024, Europe could very well be left on its own. And by the way, I think Europe really is much more on its own now than it understands, because they still act like NATO exists, but would the United States fight for NATO now? The United States would never fight for the Baltics. not
Not for Estonia, which...
Not for Estonia. No. So in that sense, NATO has ceased existing. If Europe prepared for that in late 2023, early 2024, we wouldn't be having this discussion because basically Ukraine would be really well provided for. But they've just stuck their head in the sands, the European leadership, and they either said, I'll tell you a funny story about this, very quick. I wrote an article in Foreign Policy with Ed Stringer in September of last year, so only a few months before the elections, when Trump was ahead in the polls. And it said, okay, this is now September 2024, election is in 2 months, Trump is leading. So you have to start doing basic steps to get ready for a Trump presidency. And we were contacted quietly afterwards by pretty well-known European politicians who said, you can't say that. We said, why? Well, because we can't live without the United States.
They just don't get it. There's a joke that's told often in Kyiv, which is, how can it be that more than 500 million Europeans are relying on, is it 350 million Americans to defend them against 140 million Russians who are being held off by 40 million Ukrainians? You know, it's nuts. You know, you have this inverted pyramid. NATO. You called it the Daddy Summit. The last week of June, because Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, referred to Trump as Daddy, who was trying to make peace among unruly children. And the White House loved it. But I'll take a quote from your Substack at the time. You said, NATO is sadly now a vehicle to slow down any serious progress towards any European strategic autonomy. In other words, I was hoping that Emmanuel Macron would prevail and Trump would walk away from NATO and the Europeans would rise to the occasion and take over NATO and say, we're defending ourselves. But that's not what's happened, has it?
No, I mean, there's a few things going on here. There is the basic, and this was actually said to me by my co-author, Ed, when we wrote that piece in September. I said, why isn't Europe doing this? And he said, because we've, as Europeans, have lost all strategic muscle memory. We've not had to think for ourselves since 1945 strategically. Everything was run through the United States. The United States controlled all of our strategic thinking. And we have lost the ability to do that. There's no one who has thought about their own security without the United States. And that needs to be corrected. The problem is that the Trump administration wants Europeans to have enough hope in NATO that they'll still spend billions on American weapons. Europe's going to have a remilitarization. That's clear. If they get to this 5%, which isn't actually 5%, it's 3.5%, because 1.5% can go on infrastructure. So you could build a bridge here, and that would count as defense spending. But if Europeans get to that 5%, which is 3.5%, the Americans want them to buy a lot of US weapons. They don't want Europe to actually build up a competitive military technological base to the United States. And so that's something that the US is keeping the US from walking away in the way that Trump might fully want to, is because they want to be able to control how Europe remilitarizes. And I say this as an American who's spent my life in Europe, and I believe very much in the transatlantic alliance for most of my life. It would be better for Europe now if NATO ended.
So are the Irish right when they say they don't want to join NATO?
No, the Irish are barking mad. Because two things. One, you are now seen in Eastern Europe as bad Europeans. All right? They feel they're fighting for their lives. They are in an existential war. So if you ask the Baltics who are the good Europeans, you're not on that list. You're actually, in their minds, happy to have your security taken care of by other people. And they believe that this is an existential war. So that's wrong. What has to be is a European NATO, and Ireland has to be in it. If there's a European NATO without the United States and Ireland isn't in it, then really what's the point? So no, I think Ireland, in many ways, Ireland has been able to ultimately be the great benefiter of American power. because it means you haven't had to spend a dime defending yourself in any real way.
My impression is I know a lot of Irish army officers. I've worked with a lot of them in Lebanon and Kosovo and places like that. And the military Irish army would love to be in an alliance. And even a lot of the politicians, but there's a public rejection of any form of militarism.
Okay. Then would you sacrifice the Baltics? All right. If Ireland is going to reject being part of a European defense structure, would you be happy if Russia takes over the Baltics? Would you be happy if Russia takes parts of Finland?
There was actually
That's what you're saying.
A video on television after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It was a Russian-provoked tidal wave that wiped out Ireland. And I think that woke up a few people.
Well, that's science fiction, though. But it should be that Ireland is a European state. This is the future of Europe. Europe has to hold itself together.
I think the problem, and people in the audience might have a different version of this, but I think the problem is that because Ireland was occupied by Britain for 800 years, they don't want to be part of any alliance that Britain is a part of. I think there's a lot of that behind Irish neutrality.
Then do it through the European Union defense structure. The European Union has its own defense structure. With Brexit, Britain's not in it. But if we're going to talk about occupation, ask the Baltic states. Ask the Poles about occupation. Ask the Finns about occupations. Occupation now is the thing that's being prevented by defense structures.
Getting back to Ukraine, they've been told they can't join NATO after all, after they were promised that they could. They want to join the European Union. I think being excluded from NATO has made them more keen on the EU. At least my Ukrainian friends are looking a lot more favorably towards Europe now. The Europeans can't get through all this bureaucracy and process until at least 2030. So another 5 years, God knows will Ukraine still exist in 5 years at this rate. And it seems to me at the same time, Ukraine has a hell of a lot to offer to NATO and to Europe. What could Ukraine do for NATO? What could Ukraine do for Europe?
Well, you're exactly right. It won't do anything for NATO. It's not going to get in NATO. It's not happening.
They've got 1 million men who have been fighting Russia for 10 years, 11 years. Okay, nobody has that anywhere. They're the major arms producer in Europe. They're streaks ahead of everybody else in drone technology, to such an extent that the new prime minister said that the US wants to buy Ukrainian drones. So that seems to me a hell of a lot they could give NATO.
It's a major asset, absolutely. And you would think the Europeans would be wanting to take advantage of it more than they are. I think you're exactly right. I mean, NATO is off the table. And that, as much as we talk about the injustice, and it is unjust for Ukraine to be told it can't, Trump won't allow it in. And if J.D. Vance is president in 3 years' time, he won't allow it in. And even, by the way, if the United States preserves its democracy and goes another way, we don't know if the Democrats would act. Biden wasn't that wild about it either. So I think it has to be the European Union. And that's why your Ukrainian friends are exactly right. The key thing now is European Union membership, because that is obtainable, probably.
But Ireland has a big farming sector, the common agricultural policy. Ukraine is an enormous agricultural power. The Poles already are worried about that. And it's also got 40 million people, and a landmass would be by far the biggest country in the EU, geographically. That scares a lot of Europeans, doesn't it?
Hey, if they want to hang Ukraine out to dry, that's what Europe is.
So why, Phillips, why does it matter to the US, to Europe, what happens to Ukraine? I mean, can't we just say that's a faraway war in a country we never heard of before, 2022, and, does it really matter if Ukraine ceases to exist? Why?
Well, it certainly matters if what you then have established is the recreation of either Imperial Russia or the Soviet Union. That's the only claim Russia has on Ukraine, is the historic claim. By the way, it reignites the British claim to Ireland. Because that would be...
And the US.
And the US. Because it has basically said historical precedent allows a country to take back parts of it that were that were actually legally separated. And if you have that happen, then you have basically said to the Baltics, Poland, Finland, all of who were part of Imperial Russia, even I think they're not parts of Germany as Germany is now, but parts of Czechoslovakia, parts of Romania, parts of Hungary.
There's no end to it.
There's no end to it, that all of their borders are up for grabs. And I don't like the argument of, oh, they'll stop with Ukraine. Well, why will they stop with Ukraine? Actually, the one that's most problematic would be, I think Lithuania is about 48% Russian speaking. That would be the one they'd go, or is it Estonia?
Estonia is, I think, like 90%.
Yeah, I mean, so they would go, they'll go right for the Russian populations of the Baltics.
There's a direct parallel with Hitler. I know people get tired of hearing this, but the Sudetenland was part of Czechoslovakia where they spoke German. And in Hitler's mind, anyone who spoke German was a German. And in Putin's mind, anyone who speaks Russian is a Russian.
Or even, he doesn't, he believes they were part of, even he'd take the Estonian-speaking parts and the Lithuanian-speaking. Yes, that's the argument. And that was, by the way, their great mistake. I mean, the fascinating thing is, and it was widely accepted in the West too, that Eastern Ukraine, where they speak Russian, they won't be that upset if the Russians invade, because they're Russian speakers. That's sort of their culture. They had been Russified. And this was widely stated in the analysis of what was going to happen in February 2022. And the stunning thing is how being a Russian speaker made no difference to the Ukrainian resistance to the Russians. Indeed, the most pro-Russian speaking part of Ukraine before February 2022 was Mariupol.
Sorry?
Mariupol.
Yeah.
Which
they
fought incredibly hard. Yeah. And by the way, it shows what the Russians really think about Russian speakers.
Yeah.
So I think the linguistic thing, we have to be very careful if we're going to start using that as a qualification.
In your book, In War and Power, you criticize the so-called Russia experts who thought that Ukraine would collapse in 2 or 3 days. And there was a lot of that. And I believed it. I was on my way there in a minivan, and I thought I'd see tanks on the streets of Lviv.
Yep.
Why did they get it so wrong? And in a broader way, you also explain why the 2 world wars in the last century didn't go the way people predicted they would go. Why do experts always get it wrong?
I mean, this is the thing. People make the same mistakes over and over and over again. You want to know the greatest mistake when looking at war is the short war myth. This is First World War will be over by Christmas. Every war begins with people thinking it'll be a short war. The United States gets involved in Vietnam, it'll be over in a year. All right? And it never happens that way. The short war myth never really, or hardly ever do you have the short war. Even what we call the example, the first Gulf War, where the United States fights Saddam Hussein the first time, of course, doesn't have a clear result and takes much longer than people are thinking at the time. So what drove me crazy in January 2022 when I started writing about this is, why are people thinking Ukraine will fold in a week? There's no historical basis for this in the study of war. What normally goes on is that wars go off the rails. Going to war is 99% of the time the bad choice, because you lose control when you go to war. But people always go to war on the assumptions it's going to work out, and it never does. And what's weird is the analytical community bought that idea this war would be quick. They got so weird, they were saying in February 22, the Russians would de facto defeat the Ukrainians. My favorite one, I wrote a report on this at CSIS, in less than an hour. Less than an hour. This is a very well-known analyst. And others were saying, but by the way, it wasn't just the analysts. The US Pentagon had the Russian army seize Kyiv in 3 days. That was you would think the Pentagon would have the best analysts, and they made the worst predictions. People don't get war, I think that's one of the reasons I wrote that book, is I just don't think they understand war.
If you look at the basic facts, Russia is the world's biggest country geographically.
Yeah.
it's 28 times the size of Ukraine.
Yep.
And Ukraine is already a very big country.
Ukraine's big, yeah.
It has triple the population of Ukraine.
Yep.
It has 10 times the Ukrainian GDP.
Yep.
How can Ukraine possibly win?
How could those Vietnamese beat the United States? I mean, this is one of the questions I always get. The smaller powers, how could the United States get its independence from, how could Ireland beat Britain? You know, it happens. Wars they go down routes. And by the way, Russia is really big in size, but if you said, how could something the economy of Spain, which is what Russia is, it's an economic power about the size of Spain, all right, in European terms, that's the closest country to Russia. And if you said, you know, if I said to you, oh, Spain is going to conquer Ukraine in 3 days, you'd probably say unlikely.
I see we're running out of time. I want to ask you one last question. I often find that people who support Ukraine do not support the Palestinian right to self-determination, and vice versa. People who support Gaza, who demonstrate, who collect money, who really believe fervently in the right of Palestinians to self-determination, do not support Ukraine because they see that as a right-wing cause. The left sees Ukraine as a right-wing cause, and the right see Gaza as a left-wing cause. It seems to me that if you support self-determination for Ukraine, you must support self-determination for Gaza as well. How do you see that?
You have to support the two-state solution. I don't see how, I mean, what the support of Ukraine is the support of a people to choose their own government. And by the way, in defined borders, in control over their own institutions. What again strikes me as very odd is this weird way of, saying these people can have a state, but these other people can't have a state. I mean, I have to say, after October 7th for a while, I didn't write much about the Middle East because it seemed to me that both sides just wanted to wipe each other out. And I was yeah, and I was I didn't know how to deal with that emotionally, that it was just seemed to be both. But my view, by the way, I wrote that on my Substack, I think the US should just get out of the Middle East at this point. I don't see that the US makes the region any better, any more stable, any more peaceful. It's made it worse. It's actually, I think, created a bit of this disaster we see. So I would start by getting the US the hell out of the Middle East and going from that point. So.
We'll take questions from the audience. There's a hand raised back there.
By the way, oh good, the lights are better. I was blinded for a while, so.
You asked a question, would Ireland like to see, or would be willing to see Finland and the Baltics overtaken by Russia? I'd like to recast the question. Would I send my sons to a trench in Eastern Europe to prevent that from happening?
Would you?
The answer is no.
Okay.
And you said that the United States wouldn't fight for the Baltics.
No.
I think you're right. But Ireland hasn't signed up to NATO and pledged that it would, whereas the United States have.
Well, actually, the United States, it's very interesting. What does Article 5 mean? As Trump said, you can define Article 5 in many ways. The United States has signed up for the NATO treaty with Article 5, but how you wish to define Article 5. No, that's a perfectly valid point. But then let's stop this pantomime about being good Europeans and caring about other Europeans. And that's absolutely valid. You could say European Union is an element to get the best out of it for Ireland possible and put the least effort into protecting the rest of Europe.
Sorry, you're putting words in my mouth here. Ireland has cultural, political, social contributions to make to Europe. Ireland has supported Ukraine and refugees. I'm not sending my sons to the...
I am not willing to send my sons to an Eastern Front.
And then by the point of view of the Baltics and Finland, that means you would not be willing to fight for their freedom. And that's an entirely valid point of view to have. I'm all right, yeah.
Ireland exploiting its geopolitical security, the fact that we don't border Russia, Ireland using that. Ireland using that is no more than exploiting mineral resources that we might happen to have. It would be wrong of us not to, in my opinion.
And that's get the most out of the EU you can, yeah.
No, you don't have to take that additional cynical step.
You said exploit. You said Ireland should exploit its position as most as possible. That's what exploiting a position is.
We should work to our own, to take advantage of the advantage.
Take advantage of the position.
That is not incompatible.
Let's move to the next question, because our time is very limited. The person behind, please.
Sorry, just like the question.
By the way, I am Irish American. You know, I'm not. My family's all from this area, but you know, I'm going to probably make some Irish people upset today. That's okay.
I'm a Ukrainian activist in Galway, and thank you very much for raising so important topics. And I have a short comment before my question. Because I have a conversation with a person who supported and continue to support Ukrainians and support Palestinians as well, very actively. And we have a discussion, probably why it can happen.
Yeah.
Ukrainians, we originally support Israel. Why? Because so many Ukrainians in late 90s, beginning of 20s, they moved to Israel. And we have so many, maybe not relatives, but friends, classmates who work there and work for their army. And we listen different paradigm that you listen here in local mass media. I don't justify any atrocities. I just want to explain why it could be. And my question, how do you think media play a role in shaping Irish attitude toward Ukraine?
I'll let you, I have no idea how the media shapes the Irish view of Ukraine.
Dr. O'Brien lives in Scotland, so he doesn't, unfortunately, he doesn't read the Irish Times every morning. How does media, I don't know, I think the Irish are adults, they're grown-up people, and they make their own opinions. Unfortunately, everyone is reading a lot less print media, and they're getting more and more of their news from social media, especially young people, which is very often distorts the truth. I was stunned about a year ago. I did a column for the Irish Times on after I met two people in North Dublin, two women who'd seen that interview with Putin by Tucker Carlson.
Oh, God.
And both of them said, "Isn't Putin lovely?" And I nearly fell over, you know, and there's a strong undercurrent of disinformation in Ireland, as there is everywhere. But I think the coverage that is given to Ukraine by the Irish Times and by RTE, which would be the main media, is very good to the extent that it exists. I mean, the Irish Times has Dan McLaughlin, who spends a lot of time in Ukraine. I go there occasionally for the Irish Times and write opinion pieces about it. So I hope we're doing a good job. I hope we're not missing the point or missing any important stories. I think Irish mainstream media would be pro-Ukrainian and would be very lucid about the evil of Vladimir Putin. But I can't vouch for the social media and the more kind of unorthodox media. Yeah.
The Russians have done an amazing job, and I say this as depressed as hell, in shaping the public debate. I mean, if there's one thing, I went into the war where I was wrong, is I assumed Russia being economically the size of Spain, if Europe got its act together with the United States, Russia would have no chance. I didn't think they'd be able to take over the narrative in the United States and actually take over the narrative in places like Slovakia.
Yeah. Actually, there is one thing you do hear very often, and every time I speak about Ukraine, I hear this. Somebody in the audience will raise their hand and say, well, what about Mearsheimer, Walt, and Sachs? Yeah. These are American academics who say that NATO provoked the war. Yeah. And the question as it's asked, which I find difficult to answer, is what about the Cuban Missile Crisis? What if the Warsaw Pact had survived and Canada and Mexico wanted to join the Warsaw Pact. Would the US let that happen? I don't know. How would you answer that, Phillips?
How many times has NATO invaded Russia?
NATO has not invaded Russia.
Never once.
Russia has not invaded
How does
US.
but how does NATO provoke a war, provoke the Russian invasion of Ukraine if NATO's never invaded Russia? It just seems to me an odd way of it's giving a state, Russia, the ability to control another state because of what another organization hasn't done. All right? That's what it's saying. Because Ukraine might, as a sovereign state, choose to join NATO, Russia can therefore invade it.
But the CIA has built 12 bases in Ukraine. That's a New York Times story. Ukraine has done joint military exercises with NATO, and they're
it's a sovereign state.
To,
it's a sovereign state. Yeah. It's looking after its own security. What I also don't like is the great power idea that the big powers can tell the small powers. Yeah. And that's the ultimate base of Mearsheimer and Waltz are realists, quote realists. Right. And the realist argument is great powers can tell small powers what to do. Yep. And there's no justice. That's not saying it's just of Russia to invade Ukraine. It's just that Russia's big, Russia can invade Ukraine. That's what big powers do. So, by the way, they don't believe in justice. They don't believe, the CIA getting involved with Ukraine makes it a good thing to invade it. They just mean this is what big powers do. Which, by the way, I find any small European state that starts making that argument is very strange. If small states are going to say, okay, big powers can invade small powers whenever they want, what are they saying about themselves?
Good point. We had a question over here somewhere. I think this lady here at the end of the row. Yeah. Do you wait for a microphone? Just a second. Can you come around here because she's on the end of this row? It'll be a lot quicker. Oh, it's passing. It's coming through. Okay.
Is there ever any justification for war?
I see very little. I mean, there is a justification to defend yourself. So Ukraine, I think, has a justification to defend its borders. So I think there is a justification to defend your internationally legalized, recognized borders. I think going to war, I can't think of any good example where it's worked out. I mean, I'm looking at it, so that's why I thought the Russian invasion was, such a disastrous decision. I rack my brain thinking about when it might be a good choice or not. Was it a good choice for the North to go to war in the Civil War? That might be, you're right. It's almost always a disastrous choice, and my own view is it should only be done for defensive purposes.
Look, I'm a lifelong pacifist.
Yeah.
As a teenager, I was against the Vietnam War. I've covered about a dozen wars. I've opposed all of them until Ukraine. And to my mind, this is a just war. If you're sitting at home one evening and somebody crashes into your living room and shoots your husband and your dog and starts taking out all your belongings, you have to fight them. It's self-defense. But yeah, I hate war. Wars are bad. I agree. But we have time for maybe one or two more questions. This gentleman here is very eager.
Thanks. You scare me a bit with your warmongering almost and your lack of talk about peace and solutions. But let me ask you this.
Where have I warmongered?
What the question coming up? What about the elephant in the room, the profit-seeking weapons manufacturers and their influence on these wars? And should we, by extension, what you're saying, run out and buy shares in them and make some money out of it ourselves?
First of all, I reject entirely the war. I mean, I've been the one who's been trying to say war is a disastrous choice. The warmongers were those who said, don't defend Ukraine. Because they made this war happen because Putin thought it would be an easy invasion. So the people who were saying, Ukraine is not worth defending, Ukraine will fall in 3 days, they bear a lot of responsibility for this war because the narrative was Ukraine would fall in a few days. So I would say that in terms of what one invests, I believe Europe is worth defending. I absolutely, as someone who's chosen to live in Europe, I believe Europe is worth defending. And that, unfortunately, will happen with some kind of industrial base unless you wish to be a plaything of the United States. If you wish to have Europe look after itself, it has to have a capacity to look after itself. But I do find the warmonger comment was, I think, you did yourself a disservice with that.
Okay, last question, this gentleman here.
I'd like to ask our guest, what is your view of the current state of the war in Ukraine? Yeah. And secondly, do you think that Russia has been weakened domestically by the war?
That's a great question. I mean, first of all, I'm not a Russianist, so people ask me what's going to happen in Russia, and I say I have no idea what's going to happen in Russia. Economically, the Russian economy has been distended. It's not in a great position because it's basically become a war machine. And what the Russian economy is now is just a war machine. That's what it can do. And that's usually not a good economy to have. The war is in a terrible state right now. And what has happened is that defensive firepower has evolved on both sides. Drones have become so prevalent that moving on the battlefield is really, really hard. And casualty, if you expose yourself on the battlefield, there's a very good chance you will be seen soon and killed. That's why the battle line isn't changing. The real problem for Ukraine is it has a very small population compared to Russia. And even if they lose one person for every 2 or 3 Russians, that's still not an exchange that actually is in their favor. So the battle line isn't going to move much in the next few months. What is going to happen are the long-range attacks are going to really gear up on Ukrainian cities, but the Ukrainians are also going to attack. So you're going to see a lot of ranged attacks that go. So war's horrible, and this war has been horrible, and it's about to get more horrible. In the uplifting note to end the day.
Me? Great. That was an extraordinary education for a lot of us from a really great expert. Hard to face up to the realities of an atrocious conflict which may ultimately affect ourselves. We don't see that now, but it could happen. And the consequences of that are far-reaching and take a lot of thought and consideration. And no one is saying we should all make our minds up immediately about any of this, but it helps to have the global perspective of someone like Phillips O'Brien. And can I also thank Lara Marlowe for being an extraordinarily brilliant interviewer. Plenty more first talks to come. There are tickets left for most of them, so feel free to join us again at any time over the rest of this weekend and next weekend. Thank you all very much for coming today.